We have a little green light? That's much better. Okay. Let me know if that's too high or too low down the tie as well. Okay. So, the message today, as you can see on the screen, is Ecclesiastes. From time to time, on a number of occasions in my life, I've read through the Bible from cover to cover, and I'm doing that again at the moment, starting at Genesis 1, which of course we're doing in Sabbath school, and working through to the end of the Bible. So, as of this morning, I'm in the J's, the 1 John, the John's going through to the Judes, and Revelation is in sight. So I should have the Bible finished in the next couple of weeks. And what I've been doing is I've been going through with a commentary, a Seventh-day Adventist commentary beside me, and everything I'm reading, I'm then comparing the commentary against it. And reading the Bible from cover to cover is a great way of getting a consistent theme through the whole Bible. So have other people done that from time to time? Read the whole Bible through? Yeah, see a few hands going up. It's a great way of doing it. You know, rather than just getting a verse here and a verse there, you start to get a different view of the whole Bible and its consistency. And there's threads you can follow through. You can follow through the blood of Christ all the way through, or the name of God. But you also find other little gems as you read through, and one of the gems that I've looked at recently is Ecclesiastes. Has anyone recently had a sermon on Ecclesiastes? No, there's no one's putting their hands up for that one. So it's an interesting book to study. It's an interesting book to preach on. So we're going to go a little bit deeper this morning. I'm watching the time, so I don't like to go for more than half an hour. Otherwise we start to lose people. But we want to just explore what we can find from Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a gospel book. It has the message of Christ in it. But it's also a difficult book to understand of what the author is writing. So it's called Ecclesiastes. It's from the Greek word ecclesia. And other words that we get from ecclesia is ecclesiastical, or the church. And basically, ecclesia talks about church or worshippers or gathering together to gain knowledge. It's considered to be one of the wisdom books of the Bible. Anyone, what are some of the other wisdom books of the Bible? Proverbs. You've got Proverbs. You've also got, what else have we got there? Solomon, yeah. Song of Solomon is often considered a wisdom book. Job is another one. Psalms are considered wisdom as well. And these wisdom books are specifically about teaching, and often about teaching young people. And that's what Ecclesiastes is. It's another one of these books that has teaching for young people. Although the book doesn't specifically say who the author is generally accepted to be King Solomon. The author addresses themselves as the king or as the teacher, and it's pretty much definitely is Solomon. The book has this preoccupation in a number of places with death. So it's thought that Solomon wrote it towards the end of his life, which was about 931 years before Christ. So he was a wealthy man, he was a wise man, he was a king, but he had a lot of questions in his own mind. So the book has these lessons for us about human existence. It's a book that does transcend time. It's very relevant to us today. It's particularly relevant to our culture today, what we call our postmodern society, where in a postmodern society we can be very cynical about anything, absolutes. People will not trust in authority. They won't trust in religion. They will say nothing can be defined, nothing can be confirmed. That's very typical of a postmodern culture which we're in, and we see that around us. Ecclesiastes is either a book of dark pessimism, which a lot of people will say it is, or it's one of God's great gifts to us, to helping us understand the world around us. And it's that latter view, that it is a great gift to us to understand the world around us, that we'll be exploring this morning. And it helps us in our lives to live lives in this environment of great uncertainty. but it is a gospel book. Unfortunately, to unpack it, we do need to look at some of the negatives. So the first part of the message does talk about the negative side of what Solomon is talking about and what the book talks about before we move into the more positive aspects later on. I do need to apologise for my slides. I made a mistake. I sent a different set of slides through to Matthew, so I haven't spoken to these particular slides. So if I fumble my way through, I've got no one to blame but myself, but we'll work with those slides that I've got, but we can probably get by without them anyway. So the book is, as I said, is very relevant to us in our postmodern culture, and typically around us we have this skepticism, this lack of trust of ideals, this lack of trust of religion. There's another great word, nihilism. Nihilism is a rejection of religious and moral principles, and it implies that life is meaningless. It implies that our existence has no reason behind it. And we see that in the world around us as well. There's this skepticism, as in our work as Seventh-day Adventists. If we want to tell someone about Jesus, they'll be skeptical not only of our religion, not only of Jesus, but the very possibility of there being a God. We see that more and more as materialism and evolution creeps more and more into our culture. And humanism, that what we know in our own minds is all there is, that all that exists. The book of Ecclesiastes has many, many contradictions in it, saying one thing and then saying the opposite. For example, it'll say that wisdom is important and wisdom needs to be sought, but then shortly after it'll say wisdom is meaningless or wisdom is vanity. And it's a book that has many questions in it. Almost every other verse finishes off with or starts with, is it not? So there's all these questions that Solomon is asking as he goes through. So the book is one where not only is it given for people who have got questions, but Solomon himself was asking genuine questions that he didn't understand in his own life, despite his great wisdom. And the Hebrew word that is so often quoted from Ecclesiastes is the Hebrew word Hebel. It's a guttural sound. It's like our word lock. So most of the Europeans can't get their tongue around it properly, but we'll call it Hebel, and that means vanity or futility. It means it's like chasing after the wind, chasing after a vapor. A vapor or a smoke is something that you can see and it may look attractive, but you can't grasp it, you can't hold it, you can't take it anywhere. You might seek it and think, I want this. But when you go to grasp it, it's no longer there. So the book is implying repeatedly that human endeavours are like this chasing after a smoke, chasing after a vapour. That's the first part of the book, the negative part. And anything that we do happen to achieve, anything that Solomon achieved, is not remembered. So once the person dies, then there's no remembrance of what that person has done. So if you want to follow some of these ideas, and we'll go through a small number of them here. So if we turn to Ecclesiastes, around those Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and then Song of Solomon, we'll look at some of these ideas of vanity that he talks about. So I'll just go through a few. Chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, verse 4 to 6. Or just starting at verse 4. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 4. I also tried to find meaning by building huge homes for myself and by planting beautiful vineyards. So Solomon he was very wealthy. He sought to build things. So he talks about the vanity of human effort, the vanity of building. And what's one of the great things that Solomon built? Built the temple, that's right. And I'm not sure whether it's in, yes it is in these slides, I'll get to that in a minute. But despite this magnificent temple that he built, he says that human effort is meaningless. There's this vanity of ignorance of the future. A very famous chapter, even in secular environments, the chapter about time, a time for everything. For example, chapter 3, verse 11, "Yet God has made everything beautiful in its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end." So even though we may have this concept of time and this concept of eternity, it's something we can't grasp. We can't know the future. Time itself, Solomon is saying here, is meaningless. The vanity of injustice, that the righteous and the wicked don't get what Solomon believes they deserve. It says in chapter 3, verse 16, "I also notice that under the sun there is evil in the courtroom. Yes, even the courts of law are corrupted." And he sees the wicked getting away with great riches, even till their dying day, whereas the righteous so often suffer the fate of what the wicked should suffer. Chapter 5, verse 10, the vanity of wealth. "Those who love money will never have enough. How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness." And of course, Solomon was a very wealthy man, and despite all his wealth, he found that the meaning of life was not to be found in great riches. Again, on punishment for the wicked, the injustices, chapter 9, verse 4. Chapter 9, verse 4. "There is hope only for the living. As they say, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion." So it's better to enjoy life, to be poor but happy, rather than a king amongst kings and being unrighteous or being wicked or being unhappy. And then just a last example there is the vanity of the brevity, or how brief human life is. Chapter 12, verse 1. 12, verse 1. "Don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. Honour him in your youth, because you grow old and say, 'Life is not pleasant anymore.'" So as life goes on, enjoy your youth while you can, because there's this vanity in human existence as we age. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that Solomon, it was pointed out Solomon built a temple for God. But what was he actually thinking? The book of Ecclesiastes has potentially a different view of Solomon's attitude with all his building projects. It's called this I factor. "I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself and for God. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I collected for myself silver and gold. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, and all that the eyes desired. I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from my pleasure." Do we see something about Solomon's character at this time? What he's searching for? He's searching for things for himself, isn't he? And he's finding in this, he's starting to understand the vanity of just trying to build things for himself. He did a remarkable temple, we know that, for God. But what was his motive? Was it for God, or was it for his own glory? We don't know. But he certainly, in Ecclesiastes, he did a lot of things seeking his own pleasure and trying to find meaning in that. What's the use of effort, he asks. Nothing changes despite all these labours. So he's done these great works for himself and for God, but yet nothing changes for all his labour, all his efforts, all his pain. He hasn't really made any difference to his existence. He likens it to the cycles of nature, the cycles of the day. Our life, we live, we die. The sun rises, the sun sets. Seasons come, seasons go, then the year repeats. So it's just the cyclic nature of things all becomes meaningless because nothing endures forever. Another day returns, another season returns, and nothing new to show for it. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, he uses those terms, there's nothing new under the sun. The term under the sun means all of creation. The sun is seen to cover everything. So it's not just for Solomon, it's not just for Israel, it's for all existence, it's for all humanity. The secularists, the pagans, the Israelites, all nations this book is for. And of course at this time under King Solomon's rule, Israel was still a united kingdom. It was his sons Jeroboam and Rehoboam where there was the division of, we won't get into too much Bible history, but it was after Solomon that the kingdom divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And then, of course, Israel was taken into captivity and dispersed by the Assyrians, and history goes on from there. But at the time of Solomon, it was a wealthy, godly, God-fearing nation, having come through the reign of David. And it was blessed, and it was united. Solomon talks about the meaningless of laughter and of happiness, and he said laughter can be like a madness. You know, someone trips and falls over, and we laugh at them, or someone tells us a stupid joke, and we laugh at it. You know, where's the meaning in this? What's the purpose of this? And he's critical of that. It's like a game, going and watching a game or a sport or going to a movie. Now, of course, we're not knocking these things, but when we walk away from them, there's nothing tangible, there's nothing long-term that comes from these things. And, of course, the temple, was it to bring glory to God or was it to bring glory to himself? Our modern equivalents of a lot of these ideas that Solomon talks about is capitalism. I mean, I think probably Solomon would have made a great capitalist with all his wealth and all the things that he sought. The entertainment industry. Solomon had the equivalent of the entertainment industry in Jerusalem where he was. He had political influence. Of course, he was the king. Hedonism. And to quote his own words, he said, "Whatever my eyes desired." So he was not limited by anything. Whatever his eyes desired, he took to try and find this meaning of life. But in amongst it all, he did realise that God does provide pleasure. There is a righteous pleasure that God can give us to take. Who we are and what we do does not justify our beneficial reception of God's gifts, but they are the gift of God. Only a life orientated by the perspective of God's grace is worth living and not futile. So there is pleasure to be gained, but these pleasures are not things that we can seek ourselves. These are gifts that God has given us. I mentioned before chapter 3, that great chapter on time. We know about time. Eternity is placed in us, but we don't know what the future is. And in that chapter, Solomon talks about time and the injustice, the vanity of knowing time. You know, we might have great plans of a great holiday, a wedding. It might be a birth of a child or some great thing, a great career change that we have planned. And Solomon observes the injustice, the vanity where we seek these things, but our life might be ended, or we might be injured, or something else might happen, a tragedy, and we're unable to fulfill these great goals, these great things that we had in mind, and it's all taken from us. And he sees this as vanity. And he sees that we need to live our lives to enjoy these pleasures that God has given us in the present, and not to seek these things too much in the future. Because if we don't get them, then that is a vanity in itself. But he's mystified by this. Solomon is mystified by this idea that God has given us these wonderful things to look forward to, but on many occasions we can never achieve those. And the Ecclesiastes, we're just doing in our Sabbath school Genesis, we're doing creation, and Ecclesiastes in many regards is built upon the story of Genesis, the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of creation, having the image of God in us. And Solomon realizes this, that the image of God is placed in us, as it was for Adam and Eve back in the Garden of Eden. And he explores this degradation of the image of of God that is in us. How's that next slide going? Vanity of injustice. We mentioned that one there. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. Justice, the establishment or determination of rights according to the rules of law or equality. And those were missing, even in a righteous nation as it was at the time of Israel, or in other nations around him. He saw that the people who should get punished got away scot-free, and those so often, not all the case of course, and those who are righteous suffered the poverty or the disease or the depravity that should have gone to the wicked that he thought. So he uses the book to contrast between humans and animals. You know, he says we all suffer the same fate. Whether you're a king, he's going to suffer the same fate as a dog. Death is the great leveller. They're all going to go to the same place. It doesn't matter how wealthy and how knowledgeable he is in this earth. The animals are going to receive the same fate as what he does. And then hope starts to rise in the book of Ecclesiastes. Round about chapter 5, we start from all this depressed side, we start to get a glimmer of where Solomon is going, what he's actually discovered. Chapter 4, better to have one handful with rest. Chapter 4, verse 6, better to have one handful with rest than two handfuls full of tension. He's starting to tell us what the positivity is, to accept the moment in rest rather than have a life of tension looking into the future. Two people are better than one. There's wealth found to be love, and greater wealth to be found in love and in friendship and in fellowship than there is in all the material riches of the world. A poor, wise child is better than an old, stupid king, he says in chapter 4, verse 13. A child, a wise child is better than an old, stupid king. And those are wonderful words just to contemplate in our own lives. Wealth does not bring happiness. We are to enjoy our own labour, and love is better than great wealth, in chapter 5, verse 12. He uses this term, chasing after rainbows. So we might see something that looks very attractive, very, very nice looking, but we need to be satisfied with our hard work. This is more the gift of God than chasing up after the things of wealth that we can't possibly hope to achieve. The vanity of unpunished wickedness. He comes back to this theme of unpunished wickedness in chapter 8. The wicked get what they want in their life, and the righteous get what the wicked deserve, he writes. Then he says the righteous miss out on what they want in life and get what the wicked deserve. Yet Solomon realizes, he discovers that in the midst of unpunished and unchallenged evil, we can still enjoy the simple pleasures that God has given us and that result from our work, our love, and our friendships. So he realizes that even though we may see injustice, we may see the wicked getting away with things, we may, even on the news, it doesn't take long to turn on the news and see people that we would claim to be wicked or unjust living very wealthy, very luxurious lives. And then we see the people who have lived humble, generous, godly lives often suffer quite horrible fates, and we think, where is the justice in this, Lord? But Solomon starts to realise that there is a greater picture, there is something bigger at play, and that the wicked will ultimately get what they deserve, and the righteous also will get those gifts from God that they deserve as well. Despite the challenges for us, that despite the injustice in the world around us, is to make our lives a masterpiece by just living our lives. We don't need to seek great riches. Our lives can be a masterpiece in the eyes of God just by living a righteous life. And we need to compare that again, getting back to this idea of our postmodern culture, what we have around us at the moment. We have this attitude of I don't care. People will say, I don't care, it's all about me. Or there's no absolute truth. well, actually there is an absolute truth, but it's so often being lost in the world around us. And we have a destiny, we have an accountability with God. We are accountable to God despite those things around us that don't seem to make sense. And those things around Solomon at the time, several thousand years ago, that didn't seem to make sense to him either. In the face of injustice and even in death, we need to make the most of our lives. There's a great optimism that comes up in these latter chapters of Ecclesiastes. He's rejoicing. Rejoicing is linked with remembering God and rejoicing in our lives. That's where true meaning comes from. True joy comes from in remembering God in our lives and acknowledging Him and doing those things, not for our own sake, not the I factor, but for God, working with God, knowing God is with us and doing those things in our lives that make sense when we do them for Him. We are to remember God and enjoy life with Him, with this sense of eternity in our hearts. That chapter 3, a time for love, a time for hate, a time to live, a time to die. Eternity in our hearts. We know these things. We know almost subconsciously that there is something greater out there. That's what having eternity in our hearts means. And it's with this sense of eternity in our hearts that we can work with God and know that there is something greater in store if we live according to His way. Whereas we compare that to so often what we hear in the world around us, the materialism of spend your money now on the pleasures of the world now and get joy now because that's all you've got. Well, there's actually more to life than the pleasures of just now and those things that wealth can gain. As I said, the book is a reflection on the Garden of Eden. It draws from the creation account. This morning even we were talking about the fall and the curse, sin and death. Ecclesiastes draws from these same themes. And again, it is for everyone, everything under the sun. It's not just for Solomon. It applies to both believers and unbelievers, to the religious and the secular. It applies to the time of Solomon, and it applies to our modern world now. It shows us how naive we have been, or we so often are. I'm not knocking scientists or NASA or anyone like that, but the meaning of life is not going to be found in science, in sending people to other planets, or the latest technologies. We are naive if we think that science is going to save us. It's not. Technologies, we've had some wonderful achievements, I don't doubt that at all, and we've had some many great drugs that have helped us with our health and saved many millions of lives, but these things aren't the ultimate salvation for us. We're forced to face the desperate, irreparable condition of the sinful world around us. This world is not going to be healed by mankind. Only the Lord can sort out the world and the way it's going. God will bring everything that has been done into judgment, whether it is good or bad. And this is the message of the New Testament as well. He will ultimately bring destruction to the unjust and deliverance for the oppressed through Jesus Christ. Ecclesiastes questions the value of our activities, our work, our joy, our wealth, our power, our wisdom, and even our religion. Because if we're doing these things for ourselves, they are indeed meaningless. Although a sinner does evil 100 times and may lengthen his life, still I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear Him openly. So those things that the pleasures that we may gain may well be good, but they will only be good if they're done in honour of God, not if they're done for their own sake or for our sake. There are God-given alternatives to the pleasures that the world will want to offer us. So the book of Ecclesiastes, rather than being a book of pessimism or skepticism, is a book that confronts us with the tough realities of life and of our own existence, inviting us to reassess and reorientate our values of what we do, what we believe around God. It calls us to live a life of responsibility before God in the heart of this complex world that's around us. Even turning on the news now, we see so many confusing things going on in the world around us, and people of different opinions. But we have a responsibility before God that in all this complexity, in all this good and this bad that we may see, God ultimately will be victorious. All these things are indeed futile unless they are received as the gift of God, with his meaning alone placed around them. It is only his grace that will save us from the vanity of futility. And then, of course, what the book of Ecclesiastes is famous for. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13 and 14, before I get to that. God's will, he has told us, is that we not build our lives on wisdom, wealth, prestige, or lust. Is that we not build our lives on wisdom, wealth, prestige, or lust. Rather, we should accept life as it is, with its problems and mysteries, and savour its modest pleasures as we do. To do this is to fear God and obey him. Why should we live in fear of God and keep his commandments? Because of Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13 and 14. Very famous verses where Solomon concludes. He says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So yes, life without God, riches, every other fulfilled fantasy that Solomon had for himself was indeed meaningless, and they are meaningless for us unless they are done before God. The whole duty of man, it says, to keep his commandments, for God will ultimately bring judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Wonderful verses there. So these verses are key to unlocking the book of Ecclesiastes. We mentioned this morning in Sabbath school the book of Job. Job has some similar things about it. Job is, I think, 42 chapters long, and there's all this narrative for 38 chapters of Job. And it's going backwards and forwards between Job's arguments and his friends' arguments. But in the end, God speaks. And at the end, we have this marvellous picture of what is truth when God speaks about his creation. And it's the same in Ecclesiastes. We have this book of talking about this vapour that's chasing after the wind. And then at the end, we have this conclusion that to fear God and keep his commandments, this is the whole duty of man. So it's a wonderful conclusion that Solomon comes to. We are able to apply wise counsel to our present world and to hear a great warning of judgment and good, as well as good news for the redemption of our world through Jesus Christ. Ecclesiastes speaks of a hope despite death and despite judgment and despite injustice. This hope exists despite our inability to be able to work towards this grace that God has extended to us through Jesus Christ. Solomon's task in this book was to teach the people of his day, to write down his words, to teach the people of the future. But despite all his wisdom, he didn't know everything. And he did all these things in his life, and he had so many pleasures to try and learn himself. And ultimately, despite all the wasted time, I guess, and all the wasted pleasures that he experienced, he did ultimately find that the truth was right in front of him all the time, and that truth rested with obeying God's commands and walking and working with God as it is for us. The concluding passages of Ecclesiastes says these words are noted as being upright and true. Anything in the Bible that is noted as being upright and true means it is from God, means it's accepted by God as truthful before God. It is a message of creation and judgment and fear of God. It does have an apocalyptic message, like Revelation. The book of John, John, the author of Revelation, says the same thing. There is a judgment coming, as we read throughout the New Testament, when Christ returns. And again, the conclusion of the matter: fear God, focus on Him rather on those things that are a vanity, and keep or guard His commandments, guard God's commandments. And few of these, all humanity is urged to make sense of our life. We are encouraged to look at the world around us and to view those things that we see, both righteous and unrighteous, and to put them in the context of who we are as God's people and how God will ultimately be the judge through Jesus Christ. We in our lives need to focus on those things that are not vapor, that are not Hebel. We need to focus on those things that are eternal, those things that are from God. Jesus will return one day. The reason for the call of this book, the book of Ecclesiastes, is about those things that are not a chasing after the wind, those things that are eternal, those things that lie in Christ Jesus, things like our relationship with God and how we will be judged. Are we protected by the blood of Christ? Or have we chosen to seek those things that are just ultimately Hebel or wind or vapor? God's judgment will cover everyone, both good and evil. This hope is shared and nurtured by those who wait on the return of Christ and the final judgment. That's all I have. So I encourage you to open your Bibles and read Ecclesiastes. Don't read it as a book of depression. Don't look at it as a book of darkness. Look at it as a book of discovery and ultimately a gospel book, speaking of the return, speaking of God's judgment, and speaking of what is wisdom, what is tangible, what is eternal, and those things that before God are indeed good.